Hi, I am Tyler McMorrow, and I am here today to present to you my research on the contradictions within the Haitian Revolution. So at the start of the class, we were all asked to come up with a guiding question, and my guiding question was, what was the impact of Toussaint Louverture's forced labor program during the Revolution on the ideas and legacies of it? So first, let me provide some brief geographical information. So as you can see on there, Haiti is on the western part of the island of Hispaniola, and it's roughly in the middle of the Caribbean. But importantly, you need to know that it was divided into three provinces at the time of the colony, when it was a colony, and it was called Saint-Domingue. So the northern province, the western province, and the southern province, and I will be referencing all of these throughout my presentation. So the colony of Saint-Domingue was a slave-based economy, and it was centered completely around the idea of plantation and cash crops. And so slaves made up 90% of the population of the island, and 5 to 10% of them would die every year from overwork, malnutrition, abuse, and disease. So over the course of the colony from 1700 to 1789, 685,000 slaves were sent to the colony. And that is only the legal slaves that we know about. It does not account for slaves born on the island, nor does it account for the large amount of illegal slaves that were being traded. So there are other estimates of roughly around 1 million slaves being imported to the island. So now let me introduce one of the biggest figure of the revolution, Toussaint Louverture. So Toussaint Louverture was actually a former slave, but he was freed prior to the revolution. And prior to the revolution, he actually ran a coffee plantation in the northern province where he owned 13 slaves. But when the revolution started in 1791, he quickly joined the slaves and soon became a general leading the province's northern forces. So the revolution lasted from 1791 to 1804, and Toussaint was present in the revolution from its beginning to 1803. So throughout the whole revolution, there was a lot of politics, a lot of political maneuvering that I can't fully get into due to the time constraints, but what you do need to know is that throughout these years, Toussaint fought colonial whites, colonial free people of color, the French, the Spanish, and the British, all at varying times. But, importantly, the French ended up abolishing slavery in 1793, and they abolished it in all of their colonies in 1794. And so this was a big political change, as Toussaint now had a major political power that allied with his political beliefs, and he used this to his fullest extent. So he became a general in the French army and was able to essentially take control of the northern and western provinces completely, as he was in control of all the military forces present on the island. So using this power, he actually just straight up declared himself governor of the island, and basically began to act almost as an independent nation, making trade deals and lots of other very important decisions independently. So first, let me talk about the economy. As I mentioned earlier, it was mainly centered around these three cash crops of sugar, coffee, and indigo. So all of these have something in common in that they are not very filling. So one thing that the island really did lack was subsistence farming, as it was completely centered on these crops, and they would export these for capital and then use that capital to buy food. And one part of the slave system was that it was actually more expensive to feed your slaves than just importing new ones. So that's why the imports of slaves kept increasing over the course of the colony's life. And by the later stages of the revolution, the plantations were basically completely destroyed. So when things were settling down a bit and there was a lot more stability and the only really military threats were coming at ports, Toussaint tried to rebuild the plantations instead of reworking the economy to keep making these crops in order to import food. So this was really just a return to the old economic ways rather than just trying to prove it at all. And while it was still obviously better than slavery, I find it much more comparable to serfs because, well, they were paid, they had much better hours. If they tried to leave the land, they would be hunted down by Toussaint's forces, and was essentially seen as a return to slavery, and it absolutely destroyed his popularity among the populace. So one thing this did is it really helped cause the War of Knives. So the War of Knives was a civil war between André Rigaud and Toussaint Louverture. Louverture held the northern and western province, while Rigaud led the free people of color in the southern province. So both of them were actually implementing a similar program in terms of the forced labor, and caused a lot of political instability on both sides, and overall 10,000 Haitian citizens died. And what this did is it critically weakened the island and allowed for a French re-invasion sent by Napoleon and led by Leclerc, which would lead to the death of Toussaint. So how would I describe all of this? I would say that this program was a smear on a potentially great legacy. And while Toussaint is an incredibly complex figure, right, and as you can see, it probably wasn't an easy decision for him to do such a thing, it is often the focal point around his historiography. And when looking through that, I actually found that pretty much every argument, whether pro or anti-Toussaint, often picked this as a defining point. All the pro-Toussaint arguments would often either dismiss it or just say that it was a necessity through economic means, while many pro-slavery arguments would just say that, look, this is what happens when you institute abolitionism. You get a lot of violence, and you don't even end the practice of slavery. So now I'm going to talk about some of the arguments that were used based off this. So up here I have a quote by Jefferson, and it's the famous wolf by the ears quote. So prior to the Haitian Revolution, Jefferson did actually argue, not very publicly, but for a gradual abolition program. But following the revolution in 1791, he actually never really spoke of gradual abolition again. And in 1820, he came up with this quote, which was heavily inspired by the Haitian Revolution. Additionally, it had a large impact in the British push for abolitionism, which did successfully happen in 1833, but many French and British writers looked to Toussaint's legacy of the forced labor program and used it as an argument against slavery, or for slavery, sorry, and certainly helped push that abolition date back. So, in conclusion, the forced labor program of Toussaint's compromised the ideas of the revolution, did terrible things for the new island citizens, and completely marred Toussaint's legacy, giving plenty of power to pro-slavery arguments. Thank you.
Questions?
How do you think this compares to, in the United States, the sharecropping system and how that was implemented after the abolition of slavery here?
I've definitely thought about it, and you can definitely draw many comparisons. I'd say the big difference, though, is that in terms of sharecropping, it was like less official, right? Well, it was very similar in terms of the actual conditions. What they used to control them was not military force, but debt, right? So that's the main difference, I would say.
Yeah, just because of the very obvious difference in his actions, in your analysis, is it safe to assume that him fighting on behalf of the slave revolt, was that a politically expedient action? Was he doing that for his own self-gain?
Definitely to some extent, yes. Obviously he was a slave, but it's hard to say, right? As that's really up to my own analysis, and I would say yes. I would say he was certainly driven very heavily by political gain, but he was very good. He was very good at it, in particular compared to his peers, because unlike most slaves, he was educated, and he was actually able to communicate very well with foreign powers as he spoke Latin, which was very uncommon for any former slave.
I know our AP World textbook always describes the Haitian Revolution as the only successful slave revolt in history. And the history of Haiti since then, including these things, sort of, it's just interesting to me that seems to be, I've seen that in so many different sources. I'm just wondering if you have an opinion or thoughts or came across arguments against that presumption, because there's clearly, like, it kind of depends on where you draw the line in terms of that being a successful revolution.
So I'd say politically it was successful, but ideologically it ended up kind of failing, because like fairly or not, Haiti was seen as the global test case for abolitionism and like whether a black state could manage itself. And due to the militaristic nature of the revolution, you would see every following government would essentially be a military government, and obviously those are very like vulnerable to overthrows by its own military. So it just led to a lot of political instability, and especially the policies of Dessalines, where he set about was attempted to eliminate the white population of Haiti, really kind of destroyed completely its reputation globally, and the U.S., I believe, did not recognize it until 1865, and the French tried to impose heavy debts, like to try to reclaim what they thought they lost.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, go ahead.
Do you think that the positive impact of, in our AP World textbook, like Mr. Johnson was talking about, it says that this was a revolution and rebellion that other slave states then looked to overthrow slavery there. Do you think that influence of the event outweighs the negative portrayal of the black military state that it also portrayed?
Yes, I definitely do think that for the population of Haiti, it was certainly a positive thing, right? Like I said, even with the forced labor program, which was ended under Dessalines in the 1810s, I believe. Even under that, the conditions were far better than slavery, right? It allowed Haiti to kind of develop its own culture, right? Because it was just a mix of mostly Congolese slaves, but obviously the Congo is a very big place with a lot of diverse cultures, so it actually kind of allowed for its own separate cultural development, which was being suppressed under slavery. Yeah, also it, while I only talk about the anti-slavery arguments in my ideas, I do have a counter-argument in that there were many people who did use Toussaint as an example of abolitionism and what black people could do. So obviously you can argue it both ways. I just chose this way.